When 9 men step onto the stage to blast the most joyous, swinging brass music in America, audiences see a brotherhood of blues legends. But behind the curtain, Roomful of Blues increasingly came to function less like a brotherhood and more like a demanding touring institution. The grueling reality of over 200 shows a year squeezed its members so mercilessly that even the band's founding father had to flee his own creation just to survive. Musicians who burned out, fell behind physically, or pushed back against the financial realities of the road often found themselves replaced with brutal efficiency. Over the decades, an extraordinary number of highly talented musicians passed through the band's ranks, many staying only briefly before moving on or burning out. Yet this machine was not built overnight. Its origins go back to the late 1960s, when a group of young musicians in Rhode Island set out to revive a forgotten American sound. In 1967, the world was looking toward the future. The summer of love was in full swing. The airwaves were dominated by the psychedelic rock of Jimi Hendrix, the stripped-down blues rock of Cream, and the sprawling experimental jams of the Grateful Dead. The trend was smaller, louder, and heavily distorted. But in the quiet, working-class town of Westerly, Rhode Island, a teenage guitarist named Duke Robillard and a keyboardist named Al Copley harbored a vision that bordered on commercial lunacy. They did not want to look forward. They wanted to look relentlessly backwards. They were obsessed with resurrecting the jump blues, the swinging horn-heavy R&B of the 1940s and 50s. They were chasing the massive, room-shaking acoustic power of Count Basie, the early brass-backed recordings of B. King, and the sophisticated swing of T-Bone Walker. To replicate that sound, you cannot rely on a standard four-piece rock band. You cannot fake it with synthesizers or backing tracks. Not if you want the genuine visceral punch that hits an audience in the chest. You need a horn section, you need trumpets, tenor saxophones, baritone saxophones, and trombones. You need, essentially, a big band. Building a 9-piece band is a logistical nightmare, even for a major record label with deep pockets. But for a group of independent working-class musicians in New England, it was an act of profound, almost arrogant defiance. In those early days, the passion entirely eclipsed the practicalities. The sheer physical force of a 5-piece horn section blowing in unison behind a driving rhythm section was intoxicating. It was a wall of sound built not from amplifiers, but from human breath and vibrating brass. Audiences in small, smoky Rhode Island clubs were literally pinned to the back walls by the acoustic power. The band built a ferocious local reputation, eventually becoming a staple of the fiercely competitive East Coast music scene. In these formative years, they were a genuine family of purists. They crammed themselves into cheap, unheated vans, slept on strangers' floors, and played for pennies because they believed in the absolute sanctity of the music they were reviving. They were boys on a crusade, resurrecting a forgotten American art form. Among them was a young, immensely gifted alto and tenor saxophone player named Rich Latte. He joined the ranks in 1970, armed with a saxophone and a deep reverence for the swinging jazz and blues of the past. He, like Robillard and Copley, was a true believer. He looked around the cramped rehearsal spaces and saw a brotherhood of musical scholars, men who would spend hours debating the precise phrasing of a 1952 record. Latte had no way of knowing that he was boarding a vessel that would eventually strip away everything except the music, leaving him as the sole haunted survivor of a decades-long war of attrition. The glory of the sound was undeniable, but ambition carries a harsh, non-negotiable price tag. The music industry, particularly the live touring circuit, is fundamentally unforgiving of large ensembles. The brutal mathematics of the road quickly began to assert themselves, acting as the first crushing gear in the machine that would eventually grind them down. A venue pays a flat fee for a band based on their draw, regardless of whether that band consists of 3 members or 9. When you take a modest club payout, divide it by 9 musicians, and then subtract the exorbitant costs of fuel for a massive tour bus, vehicle maintenance, cheap motels, and the manager's cut, the remaining sum is a starvation wage. To make a living, to earn barely enough to pay the rent on small apartments back home, Roomful of Blues had to rely on volume, not volume of sound, but volume of labor. Management and the booking agencies looked at the sprawling 9-headed beast of a band and realized a cold economic truth. The only way to make the Roomful of Blues model profitable was to keep the machine running constantly. There could be no off-seasons. There could be no extended breaks for writing or recovery. The band was thrust into a grueling, relentless schedule, forced to play upwards of 200 to 250 nights a year. The tour bus, once a vehicle of camaraderie and shared dreams, became a rolling diesel-fumed prison. Imagine the reality of that existence. 9 adult men, sweating, exhausted, financially desperate, and creatively drained, confined to a cramped, vibrating metal tube day after day, year after year. There was no personal space, no privacy, and no rest. The smell of stale beer, brass polish, cheap fast food, and unwashed clothes permeated everything. They were no longer musical crusaders. They were exhausted touring professionals trapped in an unforgiving system. They were expected to deliver high-energy, physically demanding performances night after night. For a guitarist or a keyboardist, the fatigue is mental and muscular. But for a horn player, the fatigue is physiological devastation. They were blowing their lungs out through brass instruments for hours on end, night after night, until their lips swelled and split, until their embouchure failed and their vocal cords were shredded. The grandeur the audience saw on stage, the sharp suits, the synchronized swaying of the brass section, the joyous, swinging rhythms, was a carefully maintained facade. The crowd saw a party. Many of the musicians felt the strain of relentless labor. The stage was the only place they were allowed to exist, but it was also the factory floor where they were slowly being dismantled. The applause became a cruel transaction. The audience paid to see the legend, and the musicians paid with their physical health and their sanity. The creator is almost always the first casualty of their own creation when art is commodified into a brand. As the 1970s bled into a new decade, Duke Robillard, the architect of the Roomful of Blues sound, found himself suffocating under the weight of the monster he had built. The band had finally secured recording contracts and was gaining national attention. They were playing larger venues, and their records were receiving critical acclaim. But commercial success did not bring freedom. It only tightened the chains. To maintain their marketability, the industry demanded absolute, unwavering consistency. Roomful of Blues was no longer a fluid, creative experiment where musicians could jam and explore. It was a rigidly defined product. The record label and the management wanted the hits. They wanted the exact solos, the exact horn arrangements, and the exact swing that was pressed onto the vinyl. Robillard found himself forced to play the same shuffles, the same swing numbers, and the same vocal lines night after night to satisfy a market that demanded a human jukebox. The relentless touring schedule left absolutely no room for creative evolution. If he wanted to write new material, he had to do it in the vibrating back of a bus at 3 in the morning, exhausted to his bones. The pressure cooker environment of the road, combined with the poverty-level wages and the sudden terrifying realization of his own creative stagnation, began to break his spirit. Robillard was an artist, a man who needed to grow and explore different facets of the blues, jazz, and rock. But the Roomful of Blues brand required him to be a static caricature of a 1950s bandleader. The machine demanded that he surrender his individual identity to feed the collective image. He watched his friends turning into bitter, exhausted shells of the young men he had started the band with. The brotherhood was fracturing, replaced by the snapping tension of underpaid men trapped in close quarters. Robillard stood at a precipice. He came to feel that the band's structure was consuming more of his energy and creativity than it was giving back. He knew that if he stayed, he would simply become another cog in the machine, playing the same guitar lick on his 60th birthday in some obscure dive bar, still struggling to pay his bills. He had to make a choice between the survival of the brand and the survival of his own soul. The breaking point was not a sudden explosion, but a quiet, crushing realization that the dream was dead, and only the shift work remained. The architect was preparing to flee the building, entirely unaware of the monstrous, self-sustaining factory he was leaving behind. The departure of a founder is usually the death knell for a band. When the primary architect, the lead vocalist, and the lead guitarist walks out the door, the structural integrity of the musical enterprise almost always collapses. But the departure of Duke Robillard in late 1979 did not destroy Roomful of Blues. It merely exposed the terrifying, cold-blooded machinery that had been constructed beneath the surface. Robillard's exit was not a glamorous rock and roll explosion of smashed guitars and dressing room brawls. It was a quiet, desperate act of self-preservation. He packed his guitar, walked away from the massive brass-heavy beast he had birthed in a Rhode Island bedroom over a decade earlier, and chose the uncertainty of a solo career over the certainty of being ground to dust by his own creation. He had to abandon his child to save his own artistic soul. When the news broke, the blues community and the music press braced for the inevitable obituary of the East Coast's greatest revivalist band. The conventional wisdom was that without Robillard's encyclopedic knowledge of vintage phrasing and his commanding stage presence, the center could not hold. The remaining original members, including co-founder Al Copley and saxophonist Rich Lattale, sat in the suffocating silence of the tour bus, fully expecting management to pull the plug, cancel the upcoming tour dates, and dissolve the enterprise. But management was not looking at the stage. They were looking at the ledger. They looked at the contracts, the booking sheets, and the festival deposits. They realized a dark, highly lucrative truth that would forever alter the trajectory of the group. The promoters were not paying for Duke Robillard. The audience, drinking heavily in crowded blues clubs, from Boston to Chicago were not paying for Duke Robillard. They were paying for the logo. They were paying for the brand name Roomful of Blues. They were paying for the physical sensation of 5 horns blowing a Kansas City shuffle at maximum volume. The individual human being standing at the microphone had become entirely incidental to the transaction. The machine did not stop to mourn its creator. It simply recalibrated. Within a matter of weeks, the void was filled. Management quickly brought in Ronnie Earl, and the band's schedule continued with remarkably little interruption. The tour bus engine was started, the remaining musicians were herded back aboard, and the new frontman was placed at the front of the stage. The first few gigs without Robillard were a litmus test for the band's corporate viability. The musicians held their breath, waiting for the audience to reject the substitution, to demand the authentic original lineup. But the rejection never came. The crowd drank, they danced, and they cheered just as loudly for Ronnie Earl as they had for the man who built the band. The sheer acoustic force of the horn section masked the absence of the founder. It was a spectacular musical triumph, but a devastating psychological blow for the men on the stage. The successful, seamless integration of Ronnie Earl sent a chilling, unmistakable message to every single musician on that bus. It proved with brutal clarity that the band's structure could survive the loss of any individual member. The unwritten contract of brotherhood was violently torn up and replaced by the cold reality of corporate employment. If the man who founded the band, named the band, and defined its sound could be replaced without a single canceled gig or a drop in ticket sales, then absolutely no one was safe. Every trumpet player, every bassist, every drummer was suddenly confronted with their own total expendability. They were no longer a family on a crusade. They were no longer operating as a brotherhood, but as employees inside a system they did not control. As the 1980s progressed, this power dynamic was weaponized. The band entered its most commercially visible and critically acclaimed era, but the disparity between their outward success and their inward misery became grotesque. Roomful of Blues was nominated for Grammy Awards. They toured internationally, becoming the backing band of choice for legendary aging bluesmen who needed a tight professional ensemble behind them. They recorded and performed with titans of the genre, Big Joe Turner, Eddie Cleanhead Vinson, and Earl King. To the outside observer reading the glowing reviews in music magazines, Roomful of Blues was living the ultimate dream. They were keeping the flame of American roots music alive, sharing the stage with their heroes. But the reality inside the tour bus was far harsher than the prestige surrounding the band suggested. The financial structure of the touring industry had not changed. They were still dividing a modest nightly guarantee by 9, then subtracting the exorbitant costs of keeping a massive vehicle on the road. The prestige of backing Big Joe Turner did not translate into a living wage. They were your favorite musician's favorite band, playing to sold-out theaters. Yet many of the members were struggling to afford basic groceries when they returned home from a 3-month stint on the road. Because the margins were so razor-thin, the touring schedule had to be relentless. The touring culture left very little room for illness, recovery, or extended time off. If you were sick, the pressure was still to get on stage and perform through obvious physical strain. The physical toll of playing physically demanding, lung-busting brass arrangements for 250 nights a year is difficult to overstate. It is not like strumming an acoustic guitar. It is an athletic endurance test that ravages the facial muscles, the respiratory system, and the spine. When a musician inevitably cracked under this pressure, when a trumpet player simply could not force his swollen lips into the mouthpiece for the 12th consecutive night, or when a rhythm section player finally demanded a $10 raise to feed his family, the system's cruelty was swift and absolute. There were no negotiations. There was no loyalty to past service. The offending musician was simply sacked, often in the most humiliating manner possible. The stories from this era are the dark, unspoken folklore of the working musician. A man could play a blistering 2-hour set in Detroit, give everything he had to the crowd, and return to the motel only to be met by the tour manager in the car park. Dismissals could be abrupt and deeply humiliating, sometimes leaving musicians to make their own way home with little warning. His luggage would be pulled from the bay of the tour bus, and he would be left standing under a flickering street lamp, watching his family drive away into the night without him. By the time the tour bus arrived at the sound check in Chicago the following afternoon, a replacement would already be waiting in the dressing room. This is where the specific architecture of a big band became the very instrument of its members' alienation. In a standard 4-piece rock band, the sound relies on the unique, irreplaceable chemistry and improvisational quirks of the specific individuals in the room. You cannot easily replace the bassist of Led Zeppelin or the drummer of The Who without fundamentally altering the sonic identity of the group. But Roomful of Blues was heavily reliant on its horn section, and horn sections rely on sheet music. The charts, the intricately written arrangements of Duke Ellington, Count Basie, and their own original compositions were the actual DNA of the band. The human beings playing them were just the ink. Management possessed a massive binder of these charts. When they sacked a saxophone player in the middle of the night, they simply called a union fixer or a booking agent in the next city and requested a session player who knew how to sight read. A stranger in a cheap suit would walk onto the stage, open the folder on his music stand, and play the notes exactly as they were written. The massive, brassy sound would hit the audience with the exact same force. The crowd would dance, completely oblivious to the fact that the man playing the baritone saxophone had met the rest of the band only 45 minutes earlier. The plug and play nature of the sheet music stripped the musicians of their unique artistic identities. It proved that their individual souls, their personal interpretations of the blues, were irrelevant to the corporate machine. As long as they played the notes on the page in the correct tempo, management treated them as replaceable employees rather than irreplaceable artists. This revolving door of personnel fundamentally destroyed the internal culture of the band. A tour bus is a pressure cooker. It is an environment that requires deep trust, patience, and mutual respect to survive. But how do you build trust in a workplace where everyone knows they are entirely disposable? How do you form a brotherhood when you know the man sleeping in the bunk above you might be fired and abandoned at a truck stop in Ohio by tomorrow morning? Paranoia replaced camaraderie. The musicians who managed to survive the grueling schedule learned to close themselves off. They stopped forming deep emotional attachments to the new recruits, knowing that investing in a friendship was a liability. The E.N.E. Our trumpet player was no longer a brother in arms. He was a temporary contractor. The bus, once filled with the chaotic, joyful noise of musicians sharing records and debating jazz history, descended into a heavy, defensive silence. It was every man for himself, focused entirely on survival, on making it through the gig, collecting the meager pay packet, and avoiding the gaze of the tour manager. The psychological burden of this environment fell heaviest on the veterans, the few men who had been there from the beginning and remembered what the band used to be. Co-founder Al Copley, the brilliant boogie-woogie piano player who had helped conceptualize the entire project alongside Robillard, endured the meat grinder for another decade. He watched the band transform from a crusade into a corporation, playing night after night as the faces around him constantly changed. But even Copley, with his deep love for the jump blues tradition, eventually found the sterile, ruthless efficiency of the touring machine unbearable. The physical exhaustion and the emotional hollow of playing with a constantly rotating cast of hired guns finally broke him. In 1990, the last remaining founding architect of the sound packed his bags and walked away, leaving the brand entirely in the hands of the management and a roster of employees. No perspective reveals the long-term human cost of the band more clearly than Rich Latail's. By the time Copley left, Latail was already a veteran of 20 years in the Roomful of Blues trenches. He was the sole remaining anchor to the band's working class, passionate origins. He had joined as an idealistic teenager, and he was now a hardened professional, standing on stage in a sharp suit, gripping his alto saxophone. Latail became the ultimate unwilling witness to the human cost of the musical sweatshop. Night after night, the stage lights would flare, the rhythm section would lock into a driving groove, and Latail would step up to the microphone to take his solo. He was playing the exact same arrangements, standing on the exact same spot on the stage, but he was surrounded by ghosts. He looked to his left, where Duke Robillard used to stand, sweating and grinning. Now there was a different man, playing different licks. He looked to his right, where a succession of close friends had stood, men he had shared cheap beer and big dreams with in the 1970s. They were all gone. In their place stood session musicians, hired guns staring intently at their sheet music, calculating their hourly rate. Latail was trapped in a bizarre musical purgatory. He was the keeper of the flame, the man who held the institutional memory of the band, but he was also a prisoner of the brand. He had dedicated his entire adult life to mastering this specific, demanding style of music within this specific ensemble. Where else could he go? The market for a jump blues alto saxophonist in the late 1980s and early 1990s was not exactly robust. The system had him cornered. He needed the paycheck, however meager, and he genuinely loved the music itself, even if he despised the machinery that delivered it. So Latail endured. He bit his tongue, he kept his head down, and he watched the conveyor belt of talent roll past him. He witnessed the physical breakdowns, the nervous collapses, and the brutal midnight dismissals. He saw men who had dedicated their lives to their craft treated like defective spare parts, tossed into the bin without a second thought. The sheer volume of human collateral damage was staggering. Dozens upon dozens of musicians passed through the ranks, briefly wearing the Roomful of Blues uniform before being discarded. The tragedy of Rich Latail is the tragedy of the survivor in a merciless system. He was forced to become complicit in the very machine that had torn his original family apart. To keep his job, to keep playing the music he loved, he had to accept the total dehumanization of his peers. He had to learn how to play a joyous, swinging, life-affirming blues solo while standing next to a man who might be fired before the sun came up. He had to separate the art from the brutal commerce that sustained it. a psychological compartmentalization that requires a tremendous, silent toll. The 1980s ended and the 1990s began, but the machine did not age. It did not slow down. If anything, the management had perfected the formula. They had honed the firing and hiring process to a razor's edge. The brand was legally bulletproof, trademarked and marketed as a premium legacy blues product. Roomful of Blues was no longer a band. It was an institution, a museum exhibit on wheels that required a constant sacrifice of fresh human energy to keep the lights on and the brass shining. And as the roster continued to churn, a deeply uncomfortable question began to surface. A question that the record labels and the booking agents desperately wanted the public to ignore. It was a question about the very nature of authenticity in music and the dark complicity of the audience standing in the dark, tapping their feet to a rhythm built on broken men. By this era, the brand had been honed into an industrial juggernaut. They were no longer just a bar band from Rhode Island. They were a touring institution. They were nominated for Grammys. They swept the WC Handy Awards, now the Blues Music Awards, and they were flown across the Atlantic to headline massive jazz and blues festivals in Montreux, London, and Amsterdam. To the casual observer reading the glowing liner notes of their albums, the band had reached the pinnacle of the American roots music mountain. But the higher the brand climbed in prestige, the wider the chasm grew between the corporate entity's wealth and the actual living musician's poverty. The financial architecture of a 9-piece touring band is inherently cannibalistic unless supported by massive stadium-level ticket sales. When Roomful of Blues played a theater, the gross avenue was immediately sliced and devoured by the ecosystem that surrounded them. The booking agent took their percentage off the top. The management company took their cut. Then came the crushing overheads, the lease on the Silver Eagle tour bus, the wages for the driver, the diesel fuel, the tolls, the per diems, the cheap motel rooms, and the publicist's retainer. Whatever paltry sum remained at the bottom of this ledger was then divided by 9. The men wearing the sharp matching suits on stage, the men actually generating the sound, blowing their lungs out, and sweating under the stage lights, were the absolute bottom rung of the food chain. They were the blue-collar workers in a factory where the intellectual property was owned by the executives. This economic desperation was the whip management used to keep the conveyor belt moving. They knew that working-class musicians, many of whom had no formal education outside of their instruments and families to feed back home, could not afford to miss a single paycheck. This leverage allowed the system to enforce an environment of indentured servitude. The musicians were terrified to complain about the grueling travel schedules, the lack of health insurance, or the hazardous working conditions. If a tenor saxophonist developed a severe dental issue, a career-ending catastrophe for a horn player, he could not ask for a week off to recover. A week off meant a week of canceled shows, and the machine did not tolerate canceled shows. He was expected to numb his gums with whatever painkillers he could find, step onto the stage, and blow through the agony. If the pain became too great, or if the sheer exhaustion finally triggered a mental collapse, the resolution was swift, clinical, and devoid of any human empathy. The system would simply move to replace the player with little hesitation. The ailing musician would be pulled aside, usually in a fluorescent-lit motel hallway or a sterile backstage dressing room, and told that his services were no longer required. There was no severance package, no gratitude for the years he had dedicated to building the band's reputation, and no safety net. He was handed a bus ticket back to whichever town he had been recruited from, and erased from the company roster. The profound cruelty of this system was matched only by its terrifying efficiency. Because the band relied heavily on arranged horn charts, management could replace individual players more easily than in a looser, chemistry-driven rock group. These charts were the true assets of the company. Because the music was written down, it could be replicated by any highly trained, musically literate session player. When a veteran member was fired at midnight, a frantic call was placed to a booking agent in the next major city. A young, hungry graduate from the Berklee College of Music or a desperate local jazz player looking for steady work would be hired over the phone. The next afternoon, this stranger would walk onto the tour bus, a hired gun clutching a saxophone case. He did not know the history of the band. He had not slept on freezing floors with Duke Robillard in the 1970s. He did not know the inside jokes, the shared traumas, or the blood that had been spilled to build the reputation he was about to benefit from. He was simply handed the binder of charts, given a matching suit, and told to stand on his designated X on the stage. When the curtain went up, he read the ink on the page and played the notes. The audience, blinded by the stage lights and intoxicated by the swinging rhythm, cheered just as loudly. They did not care that the soul of the music, the deep, intuitive, unspoken communication between men who have suffered together, had been replaced by the sterile accuracy of sight reading. The brand remained intact, only the human components were swapped out. Over the decades, this process repeated itself with unsettling regularity. More than 50 musicians appear to have passed of the band over the decades, reflecting a remarkably high level of turnover. Highly talented, passionate artists were swallowed by the brand, stripped of their individual creative identities, and then spat out when they were broken. Even the frontmen, the supposed faces of the franchise, were not immune. Exceptional vocalists and instrumentalists like Sugar Ray Norcia, Lou Ann Barton, and Curtis Salgado came into the fold, delivered critically acclaimed performances, and eventually collided with the exact same wall of corporate exploitation. They realized that no matter how much the audience loved them, they were merely temporary custodians of a trademark they would never own. When they inevitably pushed back against the exhausting schedule or demanded a fairer piece of the financial pie, they were shown the door. The machine proved time and time again that the brand was the absolute master, and everyone else was just an employee. Amidst this relentless, churning chaos, only one constant remained: Rich Latale. While over 50 men came and went, while founders fled and vocalists were fired, Latale remained. He was the anchor, the veteran tenor and alto saxophonist who had been there since the gritty, passionate days of 1970. He became the most enduring recorded presence in the band's history and one of the last living links to its earliest years. But in a system designed to exploit and discard human beings, survival is not a victory. It is a profound, isolating trauma. Latale was trapped in a highly lucrative, critically acclaimed purgatory. He genuinely loved the music. Jump blues and swing were written into his DNA. He had dedicated his entire life to mastering this incredibly specific, demanding art form. But the only vehicle available to him to play this music on a grand scale was the very machine that was systematically destroying his peers. He was forced to become the institutional memory of a band that desperately wanted to erase its own past. A gene the psychological dissonance Latale had to endure night after night. The music of Roomful of Blues is inherently joyous. It is designed to make people dance, to lift their spirits, to swing with an infectious, life-affirming energy. The horn section is required to sway in unison, to smile, to project an image of absolute, coordinated brotherhood. But behind the smile, Littell was standing in a graveyard. He would take his position on stage right, clip his saxophone to his neck strap, and look out at the screaming, joyous crowd. Then, he would look to his left. He was playing a song they had written in a cramped basement 20 years ago, but the faces looking back at him were strangers. He was surrounded by phantoms. The ghost of Duke Robillard, the ghost of Al Copley, the ghosts of dozens of horn players he had shared cheap beers, late-night confessions, and deep musical connections with. They had all been ripped away, replaced by young, anxious session players staring intently at their music stands, terrified of missing a cue and losing their jobs. Littell had to mourn his friends in silence, while playing the happiest music on earth at maximum volume. He was forced to witness firsthand the complete commodification of his own youth. Every time management fired another brother and brought in a replacement, Littell had to swallow his grief, extend his hand to the new recruit, and teach him the nuances of the charts. He became a mentor to men he knew he could not afford to befriend. He had to build emotional walls just to survive the tour, knowing that if he allowed himself to care about the new trumpet player or the new bassist, he would only be subjected to the pain of watching them be discarded a few months later. He was a man standing perfectly still on a violently moving conveyor belt, trying desperately to hold on to the soul of a band that the corporate entity had hollowed out decades ago. This is the ultimate hidden cruelty of the legacy band Sinus model. It forces the survivors to become complicit in the erasure of their own history. Littell could not stop the machine, nor could he easily walk away from the only livelihood he had ever known. He was a working-class musician in a niche genre. There was no safety net waiting for him if he quit. So he endured. He put on the suit, he polished the brass, and he played the solos with a ferocity and a passion that belied the hollow emptiness of the stage around him. He became a living monument to the endurance of the human spirit, trapped inside a corporate exhibit. As the 1990s wore on, the Roomful of Blues brand solidified its status as an untouchable institution in the blues world. They had survived the shifting tastes of multiple decades, outlasted the grunge era, and maintained their rigorous touring schedule. But the facade of the hardest working band in show business had become a grotesque parody of itself. The music press continued to write glowing reviews about their tight-knit chemistry and their authentic brotherhood, completely oblivious to the fact that the chemistry was manufactured by sheet music and the brotherhood was mandated by an employment contract. The tragedy had been perfectly sanitized. The exploitation had been hidden beneath sharp suits, flawless arrangements, and a highly polished stage image. But the bill for this illusion was coming due, and it would demand a reckoning with the very legacy the machine had fought so ruthlessly to protect. The 1990s and early 2000s brought a strange, sanitized prestige to Roomful of Blues. They were no longer the ragged, hungry crusaders from Rhode Island fighting to resurrect a forgotten genre. They had become the established aristocrats of the blues revival. They were sweeping the W.C. Handy Awards. Their albums were receiving widespread critical acclaim, and they were the undisputed kings of the festival circuit. To the casual observer, the band had achieved the ultimate American musical dream. They had survived the shifting cultural tides, outlasted the synthesizers of the 80s, and cemented their legacy. But in the music industry, prestige is very often a velvet glove covering an iron fist. The corporate machine had not mellowed with age or success. It had simply become more ruthlessly efficient at hiding the blood on the factory floor. The fundamental paradox of Roomful of Blues in this era is deeply rooted in the very nature of the music they played. The blues, at its core, is the ultimate expression of individual human suffering, resilience, and unique identity. It is a genre built on the raw, unfiltered translation of a musician's soul through their instrument. Yet the management and the touring apparatus had successfully industrialized it. They had taken a genre defined by passionate improvisation and turned it into an assembly line. The sheet music, the massive binders of horn charts that dictated every breath and every pause, had become the absolute master. The charts were the script and the musicians were merely actors hired to read their lines. This commodification of soul is the central tragedy of the band's middle years. The financial realities of the 1990s music industry were shifting. The massive blues boom of the previous decade, spearheaded by artists like Stevie Ray Vaughan, was beginning to wane. Compact disc sales were plateauing for legacy acts. The only way to feed the nine-headed beast to keep the management company profitable and the tour buses fueled was to increase the volume of live performances. The margins were shrinking, which meant the sweatshop conditions had to intensify. The bus rides between gigs grew longer, the motels grew cheaper, but the men on stage still had to step into the spotlight, wearing immaculate suits, projecting an image of effortless, swinging joy. The most glaring evidence of the machine's callousness during this period was the revolving door of frontmen. Management understood that a nine-piece band needed a focal point, a charismatic figure at the center of the stage to distract the audience from the constantly rotating cast of horn players in the shadows. They needed a voice to replace the ghost of Duke Robillard. Over the years, they drafted in phenomenal talents. Men like Sugar Ray Norcia, a brilliant vocalist and harmonica player, stepped into the void. Norcia gave the band a massive commercial boost, fronting them during some of their most successful recording years. He brought a distinct, commanding presence that briefly made the band feel like a cohesive, living organism again. But the machine treats a frontman with the exact same ruthless calculus as a trombonist. The lead singer was just another contractor, albeit one with a slightly larger spotlight. When the relentless 200-night-a-year touring schedule began to grind Norcia down, when the physical toll of singing over a roaring brass section night after night damaged his vocal cords, and when the financial realities of being an employee rather than an owner became impossible to ignore, the system did not pause to accommodate him. The machine does not negotiate with its parts. In 1998, after 7 grueling years of carrying the brand on his back, Norcia walked away. Did the band cancel the upcoming tour? Did they take a year off to regroup and find their new voice? Absolutely not. The engine did not even stutter. Management simply reached into their Rolodex, made a few phone calls, and slotted in another vocalist. McKinley Howard, Colin Linden, Mark Dufresne, Phil Pemberton. The names change, the faces change, but the brand marched on. The sheer audacity of replacing the lead singer of a band without missing a single booking is staggering. It completely shatters the illusion that a band is a family. It proves, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that Roomful of Blues was a corporate trademark. The singers were essentially franchise managers, hired to run the store until they burned out, at which point the keys were simply handed to the next applicant. Imagine the psychological toll of stepping onto that tour bus as a new recruit, whether as a lead vocalist or a fifth trumpet player, You are a ghost from day one. You walk down the narrow aisle of the bus, stowing your gear above the bunk of a man who was fired 3 days ago. You are not encouraged to innovate, you are instructed to replicate. You are handed a uniform and a binder of music. You are playing songs that are supposed to be deeply personal expressions of sorrow and joy, but you are doing so as a faceless employee of a legacy brand. If you try to change the phrasing of a solo, or if you suggest a new arrangement, you are quickly reminded that the audience did not pay to hear your personal artistic vision. They paid to hear the record they bought in 1985. The alienation of playing the most emotional music on earth in the most sterile, restrictive environment imaginable is a quiet, soul-crushing agony. But why did this system survive? Why did it thrive for decades, chewing up over 50 talented musicians and spitting them out into obscurity? The uncomfortable truth is that the system survived because we, the audience, allowed it to. We are deeply complicit in the machinery of legacy touring acts. When fans bought tickets to see Roomful of Blues in the late 90s and 2000s, they were not buying tickets to see a living, breathing, evolving artistic entity. They were purchasing a time machine. They wanted nostalgia. They wanted the comfort of the familiar. The audience's applause validated the management's ruthlessness. As long as the brass section swayed in perfect unison and the rhythm section locked into that infectious driving shuffle, the crowd in the theater did not care whose lips were bleeding against the mouthpiece. They cheered for the logo stenciled on the kick drum. The market's demand for a static, unchanging product provided the perfect cover for the exploitation happening back stage. We, the consumers of music, often prefer the comfortable lie of the brand over the messy human reality of the artists. We want the horns to blow on cue, and we prefer not to know if the man blowing them is sleeping sitting up in a van to make rent. Amidst this industrialized churn, the figure of Rich Littell takes on an almost mythic, tragic weight. As the band crossed into a new millennium, Littell was no longer just a veteran. He was an anomaly. He was the undisputed elder statesman, the only remaining sonic link to the band's working-class, passionate origins in Rhode Island. But seniority in a sweatshop does not grant you executive power. Littell had no control over the firings, the hirings, or the punishing tour schedules. He was simply the most enduring employee on the payroll. The physical reality of his survival is staggering. To play the saxophone professionally requires immense breath control, core strength, and facial endurance. To do it for over 30 years, standing under hot stage lights while wearing a heavy suit, absorbing the impact of millions of road miles in a vibrating bus, is an act of extreme physical punishment. Littell's body became a living testament to the band's longevity, carrying the aches, the damaged hearing, and the deep, bone-weary fatigue that comes from a lifetime of nocturnal labor. He watched the youth drain from the faces of the new recruits. He saw eager, bright-eyed musicians fresh out of conservatory step onto the bus, only to watch them hollow out within a year, their passion replaced by the grim determination of a shift worker. Littell was the custodian of a haunted house. He knew the stories of every man who had ever occupied the seats next to him. He knew who had broken down, who had been fired unfairly, and who had simply vanished into the night. Yet, every evening at 8 o'clock, he had to put his horn to his lips and swing. He had to generate joy on demand, standing in a sea of interchangeable, strange R's, tethered to a brand that had long ago forgotten its own soul. As Roomful of Blues approached its 30th and then its 40th anniversaries, the corporate marketing machine shifted into high gear. The record labels released compilation albums. The booking agents commanded higher guarantees for anniversary tours. Celebrating 40 years of Roomful of Blues, the poster screamed. But there is a grotesque, cynical irony in celebrating the longevity of a collective when the actual human beings who built it, bled for it, and wrote its history were long gone. The men who starved in the unheated vans in the 1970s were not sharing in the anniversary profits. They were discarded components. The entity being celebrated was not a brotherhood. It was a legally protected trademark. The logo was immortal, but the men were utterly expendable. The band was moving deep into the 21st century. The music industry was changing, the internet was destroying record sales, and the live touring circuit was becoming more brutal and consolidated than ever before. Roomful of Blues was about to face the ultimate reckoning of its own design. How long can a machine run when the original parts are nothing but dust? How long can you sell a soul that was sold off piece by piece decades ago? The final act of this tragedy is not a sudden crash, but the slow, haunting realization of what legacy truly means in a system where capitalism always wins. The 21st century arrived not with a crescendo, but with a sudden silent evaporation of the traditional music industry. The advent of digital downloading and streaming services completely gutted record sales, the very revenue streams that had once provided a meager secondary financial cushion for touring musicians. If the financial architecture of a 9-piece band was cannibalistic, in the 1980s and 1990s, the new millennium turned it into a desperate fight for absolute survival. The road was no longer just a part of the job, it became the only oxygen left in the room. For Roomful of Blues, the corporate machine had to adapt to this harsh new climate, and its method of adaptation was brutally simple. It squeezed the remaining human components even harder. As the digital age rendered physical albums obsolete, the live performance became the sole currency of the working musician. But the costs of touring, fuel, insurance, vehicle maintenance, and accommodation were skyrocketing. To keep the Roomful of Blues brand profitable, the management had to ensure the calendar was permanently black with ink. There could be no off-seasons. The band was effectively transitioned into the musical equivalent of the modern gig economy, long before the term was ever coined. The men wearing the immaculate suits on stage were essentially freelance contractors, stripped of any illusions of job security, pensions, or health care. They were handed a schedule, a binder of sheet music, and a brutal ultimatum: play through the exhaustion, or your replacement will be on the next flight out of Boston. By the 2000s, Roomful of Blues was no longer a band. It was the ultimate musical ship of Theseus. Over 50 musicians had been chewed up and spat out by the touring machine, a roster the size of a professional football team. The original planks were gone, and the men in the promotional photos were no longer a brotherhood forged in artistic struggle. They were simply shift workers wearing matching uniforms. Only the trademark painted on the hull remained. The brass section was tight, the rhythm was flawless, and the vocals were powerful, but the collective soul was entirely synthetic. Looking back at Duke Robillard's desperate escape in 1979, his decision suddenly makes perfect sense. Robillard chose the terrifying uncertainty of a solo career over the financial security of the brand he had built. In doing so, he saved his life as an artist. Over the subsequent decades, Robillard became a highly respected, deeply influential elder statesman of the blues. He recorded dozens of albums, explored jazz, swing, and rockabilly, and collaborated with legends on his own terms. He aged with dignity, retaining absolute control over his creative output and his touring schedule. The contrast between the creator and the creation is a devastating indictment of the corporate music model. Robillard kept his soul, but lost the brand name. The machine kept the brand name, but lost its soul. The corporate entity known as Roomful of Blues continued to play the songs Robillard had conceptualized in a cramped Rhode Island bedroom, but it played them with the sterile mechanical efficiency of a jukebox. The machine had achieved immortality, but it was the cold, unfeeling immortality of a factory assembly line. It proved that in the ruthless calculus of the entertainment industry, authenticity is a completely unnecessary expense. If the audience cannot tell the difference between a founder playing from the heart and a session musician reading from a chart, the market will always choose the cheaper, more compliant option. Yet standing in the center of this relentless churning factory floor, enduring decade after decade, was Rich Lataille. His survival is perhaps the most complex and heartbreaking element of this entire saga. As the band crossed the half-century mark of its existence, Lataille was a man in his late 60s, still gripping his tenor and alto saxophones, still enduring the punishing vibrations of the tour bus. He was the last remaining tether to 1967. He was the only man on stage who remembered what the band sounded like when it was driven by passion rather than payroll. To watch Lataille perform in his later years is to witness a profound act of endurance. The physical toll of blowing a brass instrument with explosive force for over 50 years is written into the posture of his body and the lines on his face. He has played through illnesses, through the loss of dear friends, and through the quiet, humiliating indigne tie of watching his life's work be reduced to a corporate franchise. When the band strikes up their signature jump blues rhythms, Lataille still delivers his solos with a sharp, biting brilliance. But one cannot help but wonder what goes through his mind when the stage lights go down. He is surrounded by men who are in some cases young enough to be his grandsons. They do not know the ghosts that haunt the stage. They do not know the blood that was spilled to build the reputation they are now profiting from. Lataille is an island of history in a sea of interchangeable parts. He became the last living bridge to the band's original spirit, carrying memories the institution itself no longer seemed to value. The longevity of Roomful of Blues forces us, the audience, to confront our own complicity in this system. We are deeply conditioned to romanticize the struggling musician. We want to believe that the music we love is the product of unbreakable friendships and pure artistic devotion. But our purchasing habits tell a different story. We buy tickets to see legacy bands because we want to be transported back to our own youth. We want the comfort of the familiar. We demand that the songs sound exactly as they did on the records we bought 30 years ago. This demand for static nostalgia is the very fuel that powers the sweatshop. If the audience demanded evolution, the machine would break. If the audience demanded to know the names and histories of the men playing the trumpets, the illusion of the brand would shatter. But we do not ask. Most fans responded to the familiar name and sound, not to the hidden turnover behind them. We cheer when the announcer screams the name of the band, completely ignoring the fact that the men on stage were often the latest recruits, asked to preserve a sound whose history they had not lived through. Our desire for a seamless entertainment experience provides the management with the ultimate cover to treat human beings as disposable invent Ori. The audience's appetite for familiarity and nostalgia helps sustain a system few people wanted to examine too closely. The historical consequence of the Roomful of Blues story is profound because it strips away the mythology of the American touring band. We are taught to view the music industry through the lens of individual superstars, the Jimi Hendrixes, the Janis Joplins, the Kurt Cobains, whose tragedies were public, explosive, and usually self-inflicted. But the tragedy of Roomful of Blues is the tragedy of the working class. It is the quiet, grinding, unglamorous destruction of blue-collar artisans. These were not men who died of heroin overdoses in luxury hotel rooms. These were men who had their bodies broken and their passions drained by a system that simply refused to pay them a living wage or treat them with basic human dignity. This story teaches us that the laws of hypercapitalism do not magically stop at the edge of the stage. The music industry is fundamentally an industry. It is subject to the exact same ruthless dynamics as a coal mine or a textile mill. The owners of the intellectual property will always seek to maximize profits by minimizing labor costs. In the case of a horn-driven blues band, the labor is the breath, the muscle, and the emotional energy of the musicians. The system learned that it could extract this labor, burn the worker out, discard the husk, and replace it by mourning without the consumer ever noticing the difference. As we look at the legacy of Roomful of Blues today, we must separate the art from the architecture of its delivery. The music they recorded, particularly in their early and middle years, is undeniably brilliant. They single-handedly kept the jump blues tradition alive during eras when the mainstream music press had entirely forgotten it. They played with a ferocity, a swing, and a technical precision that remains the gold standard for horn-driven rhythm and blues. The records are a testament to the undeniable talent of the dozens of men who passed through the ranks. But the brand itself is a monument to corporate survival at the expense of human life. It is a stark, chilling reminder that a name can live forever, provided you are willing to continually feed it fresh bodies. The legacy of Roomful of Blues is not a testament to brotherhood. It is a masterclass in human exploitation. It is the story of a family that was violently, hostilely taken over by a trademark. When the day finally comes that Rich Littell packs away his saxophone for the last time, when the final original thread connecting the modern machine to the passionate boys in Rhode Island is finally severed, the band will almost certainly not stop. The story strongly suggests that the institution has learned to continue regardless of who remains from its original history. The machine will grind on, entirely unbothered by the loss of its last piece of actual history, because the machine does not feel, it only calculates. The applause echoing through a crowded blues club is a deceiving sound. It sounds like appreciation, it sounds like joy. But for the men standing on the stage, it can often sound like the ticking of a clock. The story of Roomful of Blues is not a celebration of musical endurance. In the end, the story is less about brotherhood than about a legacy brand sustained by relentless human turnover. We look at a band that has survived for over half a century, and we instinctively want to celebrate their resilience. But we must ask ourselves, what exactly has survived? It is not friendship. It is not the original creative spark. It is certainly not the men who were left stranded in motel car parks in the middle of the night, stripped of their livelihoods because they asked for a few extra dollars to feed their children. In the end, the thing that endured most visibly was the trademark, not the original community that built it. More than 50 musicians gave their blood, their breath, and the best way, years of their lives to a machine that refused to remember their names. They played the blues the music of the broken-hearted and the oppressed, while being actively broken and oppressed by the very men signing their checks. The next time you see a legacy band take the stage, look past the sharp suits, look past the synchronized movements and the polished brass. Look into the eyes of the hired guns standing in the shadows of the founders. Recognize the heavy unspoken toll of playing someone else's memories for a wage. The music will live forever, but we must never forget the quiet, devastating cost of the men who were ground to dust to keep the record spinning. The brand may endure, but the human cost behind that endurance should not be ignored.